Welcome to the second season of Spoken Violets, a Sinister Wisdom podcast. Second season, as after months of rest, turmoil, grief, and change, we are back. If you didn't already know, Sinister Wisdom is a multicultural journal platforming lesbian, arts, and feminist questions since 1976. Visit sinisterwisdom.org to learn more about what Sinister Wisdom is and does. My name is Sierra Earle, and I will be your guide through this lesbian literary journal journey. To celebrate both Disability Pride Month and the publication of Sinister Wisdom 125, Glorious Defiance, work by Disabled Lesbians, I will be sitting down with Allison, Bird, Tracy, and Chatham Greenfield, who will read and discuss their works as well as broader disabled lesbian issues. Please consider supporting Sinister Wisdom at sinisterwisdom.org/donate. Now on to the show. So today I'm joined by Allison, Bird, Tracy, and we are going to talk about her poetry in Sinister Wisdom 125, Glorious Defiance. So Bird, as you prefer to be called, what is your experience with Sinister Wisdom? How did you hear about this call for submissions?
So I have been broadly connected to Sinister Wisdom for a fairly long time now. I circulate fairly heavily in more traditional lesbian literary spaces. I went to Smith College, so lots of, women's writing history back in my undergrad days. But actually, for this particular issue, in true age era moment, I have been friends care of Tumblr with the lovely editor V of this issue for probably going on a decade now.
So what's your relationship to the theme of the issue, Disabled Lesbians? Would you say that disability comes up a lot in your writing, and how do you try to portray disability?
Disability is definitely one of the core themes of my writing. As an autistic person who is also, I also have a connective tissue disorder and other mental health conditions. And one of the big projects that I started working on years ago was actually a manuscript focused around the Willowbrook State School, which was one of the major state asylums that started pushing the deinstitutionalization movement in the 1970s. And I'm originally from Staten Island, which is where Willowbrook is located or was located, and would pass the grounds every day on my way to high school. And my grandmother actually had cousins who were placed there. Yeah, so Willowbrook is very core to how I think about physical locations of disability. And writing about that took me into other asylum spaces and other bits of particularly mental health history. So my poems in Sinister Wisdom include one that is based on a photograph from Bedlam in the 1850s, one about the history of ice pick lobotomies, and one about the history of insulin shock as a treatment approach. So those are all very much about historical relationships and sort of possible lives in the past. And then my fourth poem in this issue, The Cosmic Crystal Circus, is part of a different project that I'm working on right now that is taking primarily medical procedures that I've personally had and sort of fantasticizing them into this, circus-like creative space of chaos and curiosity. On the admission of Harriet Jordan, Bethlehem, 1858. Watch cloth dance before my face, how I bite the king's penny, needle and cloak. Unhinged hands open rude mouth agape, combed my hair with teeth, spit damp rain, and ivy's tongue. Welcome in, I'm supper for the wards, for the stockinged warden's taloned scope, lapping ice water to jacketed skin. Oh, hold me here, hold me down, or I'll take your bonnet threads for roads, run down carriage wheel eyes, my all-night rain and rage at a metal bed, my naked arms unmantled mind, and Bethlehem's fury fancy men, all a table, agape, and armed with arrows, call my name from the eaves. Hearken their furrowed faces, my fingers to the hob, lopped into meals. Please wear me inside out, turn my gowns off the street, turn it all down fleet. The transorbital approach. A simple premise. 7 centimeters of needled probe cuts far enough and deep into the worst of your feelings. First Sally, her excess of sadness, how her body lurched under the electric current, settled into its stupefying bed. The jolting rod slices in, once, twice, before she can wake. In a liquid fog, her husband fetches her home. Everything stitchless, scarless, the severed edges disguised behind skull and eyes, transparent lids, near bloodless. It's a show you can take on the road, a few tools, a restive body gone restful in a few swift moments. In each town, the doctor peels back sleepless lids, and the earth is flat. Women wake tender about the nose, a bit black-eyed and bandaged, as beautiful as ever. Narcosis. Far below the surface, numb bodies convert nitrogen to clumsy delight. Salt turns to ether. Look how they laugh their way, lost, not knowing up. And in my room, 6 women deep in water, electricity flows, drugs. So our bodies swallow sleep. If we rise, dine, I do not recall. Do not recall my last day's leave, the home I loved, how to lift a brush, tame my head. Done for me now, or not. I have forgotten. Iron in my mouth, my tooth dissolved, night lodged in my throat. Every convulsion risk opens water like sky and every direction up. The Cosmic Crystal Circus. Some minerals are also metals. Barite, celestial leap of barium, plays two-faced, bitter and fizzing in my mouth, turns to light inside my gut. Try to fathom. Someone dug this up, this airy infant tightrope walking the slip of my throat, undid its toxic burning waves to watch miles of muscle and sphincter, fairy lights spanning the space from tent to tongue. I think one of the big reasons that decay appears, particularly in my disability writing, is that I do a lot of my research in the process of constructing these poems through an almost, so I have Pinterest boards coming out my ears, essentially, of images, photographs of old asylums, photographs of patients, going through documents. And so a lot of these are buildings that are actively decaying. They've been shut down and boarded up and ignored, and they're full of graffiti and dirt. And even when they were operating, many of them were functionally in a state of decay. So you read reports about Willowbrook, which again is where so much of the more dense research that I have done is. There's this sense that the individuals placed there were just left to decay. There was not support or care or intervention or any kind of proactive engagement with the individuals in these spaces. And so not only are the structures around them decaying, but they were essentially put aside to fall apart and disappear.
How does your research on institutions like Bethlehem inform how you view like broader disability treatment or mental health treatment today? Like, do you see any parallels?
I mean, certainly there are a lot of ongoing parallels in even what has become our short-term practices of institutionalization. So, I've spent a few short stints on psych wards of varying quality, and some of them were places where people were actively engaged in the process of providing services and support, and others were essentially warehouses. And when you spend a week cloistered in a day room with 50 women, and the most common request written on the supply board is just to see your social worker. Like, supply board was supposed to be like, oh, you need a toothbrush, or, you're missing some other core item. All we were writing on that board was, where are our social workers? Because we can't make any progress towards discharge until we see them. That those places are fundamentally not hugely changed. The goal was simply to make you not a danger to yourself in the shortest time possible. But otherwise, it was fine for you to go back into the community to decay instead.
That sounds frustrating and terrifying. Honestly.
And I think physical healthcare is not ultimately that different for a lot of us with chronic conditions also, that especially if you have something that falls within the contested illness category, or that is otherwise poorly researched and understood, that you're either left to self-direct your care, or you're told that this is normal, or that there's nothing more to be done. And whatever happens after that is your own problem. It's not the medical system's problem.
So kind of stepping back to the literary part of it, what role do you see, like, what do you think the importance of having like disabled literary spaces is?
There is power in being heard, but often more important than that, because we know the way in which the disabled people's stories are received by the wider culture in general, is less in being heard on a broad stage and finding that community of both commiseration and shared tools and supports. And so even as I'm writing primarily a lot of poems that have these historic roots that aren't telling an immediate story, there's a legibility within shared disabled spaces where the particular way in which one can narrate and depict history reflects your own experience, and your experience is mirrored back to you and more deeply understood by other people who have similar experiences and who have thoughts on how to navigate these systems, who have, cracked some little piece of the code that the rest of the world doesn't want us to have. And that then gives us a lot more tools to slowly advocate and make change in those wider systems.
It's kind of interesting that you grapple onto the utilitarian aspect of hearing these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I circulate a lot online when I spend a lot of time on Twitter, less now that I have like an actual full-time job that doesn't take place on my computer and involves running around with children a lot. But my Twitter feed is a pretty solid makeup of the various themes that I've described here. So there's a lot of religious content, there's a lot of literary content, there's a lot of disability content, and the ability to find the people who share a certain amount of common pragmatic experience is absolutely critical in our survival, especially when it comes to, less well understood conditions. So I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that comes with a whole variety of other associated conditions. And simple things like the ability to say, well, this is where I buy really practical compression garments to make sure I don't pass out. Or this is the way that I've negotiated parts of my employment to make it easier on my body. These different things, these really pragmatic elements are the things that make a big difference on a day-to-day basis, even as a lot of what I'm doing from a disability poetics angle is thinking about a certain convolutedness of language and alternative thought pathways, and playing with history and sound and this idea of decay and things like that are much less pragmatic.
You say on the admission of Harriet Jordan, your bonnet threads for roads run down carriage wheel eyes. I just thought that was really beautiful.
So I have this picture of Harriet Jordan from her admission, which was where this poem started, and some notes about her admission. And then that poem was so much fun to write, actually, because it's so much sound play, and
it sounds really beautiful.
It's a lot of sound elaboration where I'm just following sort of these linguistic threads as they patter along and bounce off each other, so that it isn't about that sort of communicative linearity that's expected in typical conversation or description of experience, but rather about that almost overwhelming intake of your surroundings and mental processes just spilling out is very much how the construction of that poem felt.
Yeah, and I feel like in the details you get so much about her story. Like from that one line, you get like a reference to poverty. She's been well traveled, or she's on this derelict carriage because she's, not poor or cared for. And I don't know, I really like all the details just squeezed in there.
She was a very compelling feeling character when I came across the first image of her. She's just looking away from the camera. She's got this sort of short cropped hair. Her arms are crossed. She's just really defiant looking in this image. And she was a character I wanted to capture in that way. And then there's a later image of her after she's been institutionalized for a longer period of time, where she's dressed up really fancy and she's got on a bonnet and these long ribbons, and they have, attempted to make her more socially acceptable. And there's, she's looking at the camera in this one, but still sort of blankly, as though she's, been tamed, but she's no longer in there in the same way that she is in that first image.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You kind of like implicitly address how like gender roles influenced care, especially in the transorbital approach. Obviously, that was more commonly done on women, and you describe like the husband, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Picking her up. It's very, very heteronormative.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, these treatments are so enormously gendered, especially in this historical context, but even in contemporary settings. What diagnostic framework you will be fitted into has a lot to do with factors like gender presentation. So there's a lot of gendered elements to what happens in these poems, and the transorbital approach. It was just a line of women being put under the ice pick in order to make them more manageable by their husbands and fathers. And similarly with figures like Harriet Jordan and the history of institutionalization. Were you a difficult woman? It was and it remains the question.
Chatham Greenfield, thank you for joining me. Chatham is a self-described disabled lesbian. That is their @ on Twitter. I'll have to ask about that soon. They were a fellow at Lit Up by Reese Book Club. So why disabled lesbian? Do you identify with the term disabled or disabled lesbian? How does that function within your personhood, if you mind me asking?
I love that opening question. Yes, I was very excited because I was pretty late to joining Twitter, but nobody had snatched up that.
No, I'm surprised.
I know, and it's more surprising when you see I've only been on since like 2019. I mean, I think they're just both such fundamental aspects of my identity, being disabled and being a lesbian, and then the two together as well. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I'm a Lit Up fellow. I'm currently in the process of publishing my debut novel, which is all about disabled lesbians. So it's just something I'm very passionate about. I have a lot of identities, I'm also Jewish and I'm fat, and, I have, privileged identities as well, being white. But I think of all the different things I've had to deal with and comes to terms with in my life, I think being disabled and being lesbian are the most fundamental. So hence the Twitter handle.
So you used to be a Sinister Wisdom intern. You to submit to this call for submissions.
Yes, so I am a big fan of Sinister Wisdom. I found out about Sinister Wisdom through Sarah Youngblood Gregory. They are, I believe, still a board member, or at least involved with Sinister Wisdom. And we're both disabled lesbian Floridians. So I met them online and found out about Sinister Wisdom, and then ended up being an intern. And I loved working with Sinister Wisdom. It was so delightful. It was I can't speak more highly of it. And so of course I was excited to see there was a disabled lesbian issue, and I applied or submitted, and that was back in 2020. So I wrote a very angsty poem, a prose poem that I may have written a bit differently now because I'm constantly growing as a writer. And you know, when they got back to us in this year and said they told us we were accepted, but then when it came time to publish, you know, it was sort of a question of, do you still want to publish this? And I went back and forth on it for a while because I was like, this poem is really intense. It's very angsty. And I'm still a very angsty person, but I feel like, so I just turned 24. So I'm I'm young and I'm constantly growing. And I feel like when I wrote that poem, even though I was, how old? I would have been like 21. I feel like I was still an angsty teen then, but I kind of wanted to honor how I felt then, even if my feelings are similar, but not totally the same now. And it's also just an honor to have my first like professionally published piece is with Sinister Wisdom.
I mean, you described the piece is called 10 Signs and Symptoms of IBS. It's a list poem. Am I correct in assuming that? Kind of a list prose poem?
Yes, it's definitely a prose poem. I tend to write prose poems, and it is a list, yes.
I mean, you call it angsty, but I would call it raw, emotional, visceral even maybe. I feel like you beautifully describe these like carnal sufferings, you could say, but also you seem to spin it in a way that shows your strengths and not that this is some sort of deficit on the part of your organs, which is an interesting dynamic. So what inspired you to write this particular piece?
Yeah, so I was definitely inspired by my own irritable bowel syndrome. That's a lot of what I write about. That's a big premise in my book that I'm writing right now, in all of my writing. I have a lot of health conditions, not just IBS. And I've always found it's interesting because my IBS is one of the most debilitating disabilities I have, and yet it's taken the least seriously by other people. So I like to, and it's so common and of a disability, but of an illness. So I just kind of wanted to honor the pain it brings me. You know, I think people have a lot of misconceptions about IBS because, so I think I write about this actually in the poem. I'm trying to remember because I did write it a few years ago. But so irritable bowel syndrome is an umbrella term. It's basically so I got a colonoscopy when I was 19, which was a very intense experience.
That must have been very traumatic.
Yes, it was. I actually got my driver's license today. So I got a colonoscopy before I got my driver's license. So yeah, it was a very intense, traumatic time. It was during my spring break in college. And basically, yeah, they do the colonoscopy. You know, if you don't test positive for other illnesses like Crohn's or celiacs, etc., which I've been tested for all of them, they just say, okay, you have IBS. Basically, your bowels are irritated. So I think part of the reason why it's not taken seriously is because IBS is so common. So for some people, it's really mild and doesn't affect them day to day. So then they assume that my IBS is similar, when in reality, I mean, there are nights, literally last night, where I'm like in screaming pain, and I've cut out most foods. I don't eat fried foods. I don't eat dairy. I'm very careful about what I eat. I exercise. It doesn't matter. And so, yeah, so I mean, that was part of why I was, even though I was like, you know, I wrote this 2 years ago, when I ran it differently, I wanted to honor that pain. And, you know, my novel is And I'm not just trying to plug my novel. It's not out yet.
No, it's okay.
I'm just
I want to
passionate
hear. I
about
want to
it.
listen.
But my novel is a young adult novel. And I think, yeah, part of the reason I wanted to do that is to just honor the sort of, like I was saying, like teenage angst that comes along with being disabled that continues into adulthood, because I think disability, I was saying this to you before we started, I think disability is a beautiful, wonderful thing, and I don't see it as a negative thing, but that doesn't mean it's not also a hard thing that can, depending on your disability, with most disabilities, affect your life every day. So yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. I'm kind of rambling, but it all comes down to just honoring that pain in myself and in other people.
Mm. So I'm hearing you say that you wanted to take this more generalized concept of IBS and make it specific to the sensations in your body. I feel like pain is such an untranslatable experience, so I can definitely see you playing around with that.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. It's hard to, you can never explain to other people exactly what your pain feels like, but what you can explain is the emotions that that pain brings you. And I think that's what I try to do with my writing. I typically write romance, which comes up a bit in my poem.
Yeah.
And I typically write romantic comedies specifically. That's what my book is. That's what I read. You know, I'm a huge, like, Nora Ephron nut. Like, I love romantic comedies. And it's definitely a hard thing and an important thing to write romance that intertwines with trauma and negative emotions. That, I mean, I'm not writing these negative emotions being from the relationship, like in the piece, it's from the self, like from the body. I kind of like to write a span of emotions, of sort of like the dark emotions of the pain and the tortured pain and the sadness and anger and frustration. I think it's all about showing the nuances of disabled life, of we can struggle and have these flare-ups that knock us into bed, or, you know, have barriers accessing society, but that doesn't mean we are entirely miserable all the time, like a lot of able-bodied people think.
Is there a line that you tend to toe between not trying to romanticize any sort of illness and depicting it in a full human way?
I think the most important thing to me is writing from the perspective of the disabled person. I think the biggest issues I see, and anytime I see romanticization of disability, it's not of the disability itself, it's of able-bodied people being able to, quote unquote, save disabled people. So, like in my book, for example, the main character and the love interest are both disabled. So there's not that dynamic of, oh, I'm saving you. But I mean, and, you know, another good example of that is the young adult book Sick Kids in Love by Hannah Moskowitz is a beautiful book about two Jewish disabled teenagers falling in love. And I love narratives like that, like stories of two disabled people falling in love. I mean, I've only ever dated people who are also physically disabled, actually. And I think the media tends to push these narratives of there's one able-bodied person and one disabled person, and the disabled person is not only a burden, but teaches the able-bodied person a lesson, rather than having the disabled person learn and grow. And I think you can do that narrative with an able-bodied person and a disabled person, if, you know, in the context of romance. You just have to be careful about it and make sure the story is, I would say, to make sure the story is centered on the disabled person and not using the disability as a prop to teach an able-bodied character or figure in a piece a lesson, if that makes sense. Yeah, because in my poem, it's a prose poem, so like the disabilities, there's a girlfriend who, you know, comes about part of the way through the poem, and there's no disability status mention of the girlfriend.
No.
I couldn't tell you what it is, but that's not the point. You know, it's about how the disabled main, you know, speaker is feeling within that relationship and within. Follow me on Twitter, and then you will know when my book is coming out, if you want to read a disabled Jewish lesbian rom-com that takes place in a time loop. So it's fun stuff.
Oh, I'm sold.
Yes. So I'd say, yeah, Disabled Lesbian on Twitter. And then my Instagram is just my name, Chatham Greenfield. And then you'll be the first to know what's going on with me. And otherwise, my poem is in the Sinister Wisdom issue, so you can read that.
Thank you for talking with me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it too.
Hi there, I'm Chatham Greenfield, and this is a reading of my prose poem from Sinister Wisdom 125, Glorious Defiance, work by Disabled Lesbians. 10 signs and symptoms of IBS. 1. You were born a month early and the world was not ready for you. Your crib was not built yet, so you slept in a bed made of blankets, not knowing that one day they would become you. 2. You emerged tongue-in-cheek, but never learned to swallow. You grew teeth, but never learned to chew. Your girlfriend tries to cook for you. Eggs Benedict with runny yolks, scalloped potatoes with extra garlic, mac and cheese lathered in breadcrumbs. After a few long nights spent hunched over the toilet, she downgrades. Oatmeal with a touch of cinnamon and peeled apples, toast with a single layer of strawberry jam, a simple pot of rice. No matter what you eat, it ricochets. There's no food strong enough to be held by you. 3. You shit out rock candy still fully formed. You shit out moss still matted together. You shit out the gum that fell from her mouth into yours when you kissed her last night, still sticky. You shit out the camera the same way it came in. You shit out a baby's fist and flush it down the drain, and there's no strength left in you to mourn. 4. You stay up all night, every night. You expect the toilet part, but you do not expect the bed part. No one tells you that bit of it. No one tells you that you will have no choice but to learn to live a life horizontal. No one tells you that you can spend years looking up at a ceiling and it will never bother to look back. 5. Your sheets are white, and you know this is taboo, but you still sleep in them every night. Your body is a stain that cannot be washed out anyways. 6, it's an umbrella term. It's a, we have nothing to explain why your colon thinks food is poison, so here's this. Here's this. Have it, it's yours, really. No one will ever take it seriously, but it's still yours. 7, it's only yours, too. She gives up her thigh when the pain is so bad you need something to dig your nails into. She gives up her hand to hold your hair back when things come out the other end, because one route apparently is not enough. She gives up her ear when you scream and her arms when you cry, but she cannot give up her stomach just as you cannot give up yours. 8, some nights, the pain is so bad that you nudge her awake, convinced you have appendicitis. This is how you make sense of it. You tell yourself that you are not hurting because you dared to eat a turkey sandwich with one slice of cheese on it. You tell yourself you are hurting because a part of you is swollen. You want to believe that there is a boiling point and you have reached it. You want to believe that at the end of the day, you will rupture and everything will become clear. 9, one day you have a dream that your heating pad has melted to your stomach. When you wake up, your first thought is not of fear, but of convenience. Oh, the places you could go if the pain was perpetually numbed. To the farmer's market with her to buy fresh scones that you could maybe even take a bite of. To the middle of a deep forest for a picnic date with no bathroom in sight or mind. To the world of the upright. 10, if food is love, then maybe your love for her is simply spilling over. Try as you might, you can't keep it down. Let her hold your hair back. Let her press a hand to your heating pad. Let her lie down beside you. Let her lean in close, hover just an inch above your face. Remind yourself that lips that cannot eat can still kiss. This is not everything, but boy, is it something.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Spoken Violets. If you'd like to support Sinister Wisdom, head over to sinisterwisdom.org/donate or subscribe to the journal at sinisterwisdom.org/donate. Keep up to date with all of our lesbian community events and news by subscribing to the Sinister Wisdom newsletter while you're there. Thanks again for joining us. I hope this episode of Spoken Violence has roused you to lesbian actions. See you next time.